Hello and welcome to this repair tutorial, and today we're going to look at a Rotel and the model number is RB-03. In terms of general specifications, continuous power output is 2 times 70 watts into 8 ohm speakers, but you can also reconfigure this amplifier internally by moving a number of jumpers, and then the amplifier then can operate in a bridge mono mode, providing a single output of 1 times 180 watts into 8 ohm speakers, or 1 times 200 watts into a 4 ohm speaker. Frequency response is 10 Hz to 100 kHz, and then total harmonic distortion over the range of 20 Hz to 20 kHz is 0.03%. Input sensitivity is 1 volt, input impedance is 33 kiloohms, and then dimensions is 435 by 92 by 334, and that's your width, height and depth, and the amplifier weighs 7.5 kilograms. Now when we take a look from the top, you can see the large toroidal transformer which is closest to you, and then on the right hand side what you can see that this is used for the trigger input, and this is the control board, and we'll come back to that later, and then left and right hand channels, and also the large electrolytic capacitors at the rear of the amplifier. Now the service manual provides a wiring diagram which is very easy to understand, but it's also useful if you're looking to see how this amplifier is laid out and how it operates. So on the left hand side it's showing you just a breakaway with the toroidal transformer, and what it's referring to here is the trigger control circuit board, and if you trigger that then with an external 12 volt source, you have the ability then to turn the amplifier on and off. Alternatively, you can override this by flicking the switch on the rear, and also the front power button will override it completely. Normally with the trigger you would then connect to additional audio units which you have within your system, so one master trigger input then could turn on multiple units. So what was the issue when the amplifier came into the workshop? Well, this is the second one, and there's actually a total of 4 which will arrive over a period of time. So the issue with this amp is that it required a complete recap, but that's not extensive. It's not like a pre-amplifier where maybe you have 40 to 50 capacitors. But also as well, the amplifier had seen good life. And you can see we have the classic issue of this time period, which is this brown glue. And you can see what it's done is it started now to corrode, and it's also become conductive. So what you see here is one photograph, and if we sort of move around, the glue has caused quite a large amount of damage. So what it has done during manufacture is the glue has flowed and it's got under some of the other components, and one of those components are the high frequency filter capacitors around one of the bridge rectifiers, but we'll see that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And then here, this is where you can just about make it out. So the left hand side to the 2 fuses, that's where you see the 8 amp bridge rectifier, and located there, and this is a little bit unusual. Normally high frequency filter capacitors in these amplifiers in the power supply section are normally 100 nanofarad. In this amplifier they are 10 nanofarad, so just be aware of that, but all of them are rated at 500 volts. So what can you do in this case? Well, of course you can remove the rear back panel, and then you have the ability then to remove the locking screws which hold the circuit board to the chassis, and then also there's a series of screws underneath which go through the heat sinks left and right. And then you can then raise up the circuit board, and you'll see that there will be a photograph later. I've done exactly that, but what this photograph is showing you is all of the electrolytic capacitors have now been taken out, and as I said earlier, it had gone underneath the bridge rectifier, so all of these high frequency filter capacitors needed to be replaced. Now you may ask, well, how do you undertake this work? Are you going to damage the circuit board? Well, as with many tutorials, the key thing here is to take a plastic scraping tool which is softer material than the circuit board, and then what you can do is just to apply just a small amount of solvent, just let it do its work, and then always use eye protection because you don't want any of this stuff flicking up into your eye and causing damage, and then just simply work your way across the circuit board, and you'll find that it does come away relatively easily. And again, you can use the same cleaning fluid just to wipe away any residual. And here I also had to replace the fuse and then also the high frequency filter capacitors. Now what we also found was that some of this glue had flowed around some of these emitter resistors on the left hand channel. So again, not extensive, but it did need to be removed because it was getting very, very close to one of the link wires. If you used your multimeter, you could actually measure that it had already gone slightly conductive. And then here on the other channel, there was no contamination or any glue, but you can just sort of make out towards the left hand corner of this photograph is where those high frequency filter capacitors have been replaced. You see the bridge rectifier, and then you can see these blue disc capacitors here, which are the filter ones. And then here is the circuit board lifted up. Now with Rotel, you don't tend to find extensive amount of dry solder joints. From time to time, maybe on power components, but it's always good practice just to verify that none of the RCA input sockets have any cracked solder joints. And then, as always, just check around the power components or anywhere you have a stress point. And then here what you can see is the brand new smoothing capacitors have been fitted. So these are Nichicon, and you can maybe just about make out, although it's virtually identical in terms of a fuse holder which is inside there, and all of the glue has now been removed. And then here what you can see, this is the trigger input circuit board. So you have two 3.5mm jack input sockets, one which will interconnect with other trigger inputs, and then you can also just make out that there is a toggle switch which will then enable or disable the trigger board. And then here, this is the trigger control board looking down. What they always do during manufacture is they just put these covers over the top, which are just held in place by one of the locating screws for the circuit board. What you can find sometimes on these amplifiers, and this is common with all of the Rotel ones that use this type of protection, is that sometimes the plastic can become brittle. Not in this case, but if they do, you can just use some dual-sided sticky tape or single-sided sticky tape just to hold it. But again, make it reasonably thick so you have the strength. And then here, this is the control board for the startup. There was some degree of contamination again with this brown glue, but relatively straightforward to remove. And then what I've also done as well is I've just replaced the relay. I'm not aware here that the customer was using the startup circuit board via the trigger input, but just because of the age of the amplifier, it was just replaced, 12-volt relay. I'll put the part number in the description, not costly to replace. And here what you can see is that the amplifier now has been thoroughly cleaned. So all of the dust and debris which you've seen on some of the other photographs has been removed. Then we have to do the alignment. So what you're able to see here is an extract from the service manual, and what you can see here is that we need to make a number of adjustments. For this amplifier, there isn't a separate DC offset adjustment, so if you measure from the rear terminals on the speaker terminals with your multimeter with no input connected, you'll probably read just a few millivolts. It should not be high, and if it was, then as I've instructed many times, you need to be looking at the earlier input stage of the amp. So in this schematic here, it would be the transistors which are configured in what we call long tail pair. If the gain of these transistors changes over time and you get a differential, then you'll tend to see either a positive or negative DC offset. Just simply get two replacement transistors, match up the HFE using your transistor tester, then install them, and you'll find that that DC offset is eliminated. And then in terms of your bias adjustment, you're looking to connect across the test points. So here it's test point number 1 for the left channel. And what I'm looking to do is to make the adjustment to 4 millivolts. And as always, if you have any issues with regard to the preset, depower the amplifier, spray some high quality switch cleaner into the preset and just rotate it backwards and forwards. And then what you can then do is power back up and then realign. And normally you're leaving the amplifier running for about 20 minutes until it stabilizes. And once you've done that, you can then make the adjustment. So here what you can see is that this is before. So these are the new electrolytics installed. And you can see that this channel here is low. So it's coming in at 2.58 millivolts. And then after adjustment, on the other channel, you can see now that it is 4 millivolts. And both channels were probably about 2.6 on the other channel or thereabouts. So here, this is the right channel, which has then been aligned. And then here you can see the second channel has also been aligned then to 4 millivolts. And then here, when we take a look from the top, you can see that there's no longer any brown glue issue. Brand new power supply components have been fitted, but also all of the other electrolytic capacitors have also been replaced just for longevity. You did find that the main smoothing capacitors had deteriorated, but there wasn't really any significant change with some of the other smaller electrolytics. But as a matter of course, due to age, then all of the capacitors were replaced. And then, as always, the only final thing to do then is just to place the amplifier onto test and leave it running for about 4 hours. Amplifier ran perfectly. then the top cover plate was put back on, amplifier thoroughly cleaned, and then returned back then to the customer. So that sort of brings us to the end of this repair tutorial. So again, as always, if you require any assistance, guidance or support, by all means email audioamplifierservicing@aol.com, and I'll be more than happy to come back to you and provide any guidance or support that you may require. So until the next time, I wish you all the very best. Cheers and bye-bye.